Section 14, Agency Dilemmas, Introduction, when agency is not always clear. In the previous section, we discussed implied agency and how agency relationships can develop through an agent's actions, even when no formal agreement exists. Now, we will examine several common agency dilemmas that Arizona agents face in real-world transactions. Most agency disputes do not occur because an agent intentionally violates a rule. Instead, they occur because the relationship was never clearly defined at the beginning of the transaction. The best way to avoid agency problems is to clearly explain representation, establish expectations, and document the relationship early. The listing presentation dilemma. Imagine meeting with a seller for a listing presentation. During the meeting, the seller shares personal information about their motivation to sell, financial circumstances, or future plans. At the end of the presentation, however, the seller decides to list with another brokerage. Has an agency relationship been created? Generally, no. The course material explains that a listing presentation alone usually does not create an agency relationship, because there is typically no mutual agreement to establish representation at that stage. Courts have recognized that agency requires facts, showing an intention by both parties to create the relationship. To avoid confusion, many brokers explain early in the presentation that agency will not exist until a listing agreement is signed. Loyalty to the seller. A listing broker owes fiduciary duties of loyalty, honesty, disclosure, confidentiality, and reasonable care to the seller. Arizona courts have repeatedly confirmed that brokers must act in the seller's best interests and attempt to obtain the best possible terms for the seller. This creates an interesting question. If a seller insists on listing a property above market value, must the broker provide comparable sales information to a buyer? Comparable sales information is usually public information and is not typically considered a material defect requiring disclosure. A listing broker's duty is to protect the seller's interests while still complying with disclosure requirements regarding known material facts. Dual agency creates additional challenges. As we have discussed throughout this course, dual representation creates unique challenges because the broker represents both parties. Suppose a broker acting under a limited dual representation agreement possesses comparable sales information that may affect the buyer's decision. Because comparable sales information is generally not confidential, the broker may have an obligation to share that information with the buyer, while still protecting the seller's confidential information. This is one reason why dual representation requires informed consent and clear communication from the beginning. The compensation dilemma. Another common agency issue involves compensation. Imagine a buyer elects buyer representation but never signs a buyer-broker agreement. The broker never discusses compensation and never explains that certain properties may not be shown because of compensation concerns. Later, the buyer discovers a for sale by owner property and asks why it was never presented. Now a dispute exists. The course material explains that once a broker undertakes fiduciary duties for a buyer, those duties may exist even when compensation has not been fully addressed. The best solution is simple. Discuss compensation early, document expectations, and use written agreements whenever possible. Confidentiality survives the relationship. One of the most important agency duties is confidentiality. Suppose a broker lists a property, but the listing expires. During the listing period, the seller shared confidential information regarding finances, motivation, or negotiating strategy. The seller later hires another brokerage. Can the original broker disclose that information? Generally, no. The course material explains that a broker's duty of confidentiality often survives the termination of the agency relationship. Confidential information learned during representation cannot later be used against the former client without permission. Real-world example. A broker learns that a seller is facing financial hardship and must sell quickly. The listing expires, and months later the broker represents a buyer interested in the same property. The buyer asks, "Do you know how motivated the seller is?" The broker cannot disclose confidential information learned during the prior agency relationship. Confidentiality remains one of the strongest duties owed to a client. A big lesson: agency dilemmas usually occur when representation, compensation, disclosure, or confidentiality are not clearly discussed at the beginning of the relationship. Most of these problems can be avoided by following 3 simple rules. Explain the relationship early. Define expectations clearly. Document everything consistently. As we have seen throughout this course, agency is not just about forms. It is about trust, communication, and ensuring that buyers and sellers understand exactly who represents them and what duties are owed. Online discussion questions. Question 1. Why does a listing presentation generally not create an agency relationship? Answer. A listing presentation alone generally does not create agency because there is usually no mutual intent or agreement to establish a formal agency relationship until a listing agreement is signed. Question 2. Why can compensation create agency disputes? Answer. Compensation disputes often occur when buyers and brokers fail to discuss compensation expectations at the beginning of the relationship, leading to different assumptions about what services will be provided. Question 3. Why does confidentiality continue after a listing expires? Answer. Confidential information obtained during an agency relationship remains protected because fiduciary duties of confidentiality often survive the termination of the agency relationship.